years since the Paris Agreement, we've seen ever more clearly the consequences of global warming. Yet the world has not made anything like enough progress in reducing emissions. We need action now to tackle the climate crisis. We need to limit global warming to under 1.5 degrees. Every fraction of a degree counts.
Science is clear. Time is running out. Risks are existential. To have a chance of a stable planet for future generations, we need to cut emissions by half by 2030 and then continue cutting by half each decade to a zero-carbon world economy by mid-century in only 30 years. To do that, we must each year cut emissions by at least 6-7% per year, taking immediate actions to exponentially scale climate solutions that we have already available.
We have already entered into the era of human-induced climate change, and it's going to be affecting everybody on planet Earth, and we all need to be ready to deal with it. Building resilience of the most vulnerable communities is going to be a priority. All people are going to have to cope and learn to adapt and build their resilience, but the priority needs to be given to the most vulnerable people living in the most vulnerable countries to help them develop local level adaptation.
The climate crisis is a health crisis and can make COVID-19 pale in comparison. We need a concerted response to address this because every fraction of a degree less counts and matters to those most vulnerable.
This is a moment for radical new partnerships crossing all divides, public-private, young, old, north-south, rich-poor. Leaders from business, politics and civil society pushing each other to a higher ambition. So is the need for urgency, and business has to be part of the solution. Tackling climate change is the biggest economic opportunity of our lifetime in jobs, growth and innovation, especially with the cost of inaction now way outstripping the cost of action. Forget incremental change and doing less harm. It's time to go net positive, where we thrive by giving more than we take, making this a better world for all.
Every second counts. And that's why, as a young person, I am joining the voices of so many in demanding for justice and action and in raising awareness to treat this like the crisis it is. The leadership that we see of the people in the streets and on the front lines gives me so much hope, but I call on all actors, especially so-called world leaders, to take this seriously and step up to the challenge this crisis presents us with. What will you do for your children? How will they remember you? We must act now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here in New York and a pleasure to be here physically for Climate Week NYC. I heard just before I came on some commitments made by the New York governor, the governor of the state of New York, and I welcome that. This whole session is about getting it done, and that's what we need to see overall. Now, I had the opportunity to speak last year at New York Climate Week, and I said at the time the clock was ticking on the time that we have left to take climate action, to limit the worst effects of climate change. And over the past 12 months, indeed over the past few months, that has been brought home to us. That reality has absolutely been brought home to us. We've seen wildfires which have been raging in the United States. We've seen devastating floods in China, in North America, in Central Europe. We've seen the highest ever temperature recorded in Europe. And Storm Ida caused devastation here in New York and elsewhere. And the reality is that the need for climate adaptation has never been more acute, just indeed as the opportunities presented by the green economy have never been more apparent. You will know that the cost of renewables has tumbled over the past 10 years, and this is what is providing that momentum that we need towards a net zero world. But in August, we got a really stark warning from the IPCC. You will all have seen that report. It featured across the world media. And what it said is that we are, unfortunately, almost out of time to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you will know that this is a vital part of the goal that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, in which the countries of the world committed to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees. And you know that in the really delicate system that is the world's climate, every fraction of a degree makes a difference. It matters. A temperature rise of just half a degree more, of 2 degrees rather than 1.5, would mean hundreds of millions of more people across our planet affected. It would mean twice as many plant and 3 times as many insect species losing vast swathes of their habitat, and double the reduction in harvests of staple crops like tropical maize. And frankly, it is these grim realities that makes the UN Climate Conference COP26, which the UK is hosting in November, so absolutely pivotal. And that conference, which kicks off literally in a few weeks' time, on the 31st of October, is our last best chance of keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. And each of us must do all that we can. And it's going to need an effort from all of us. We need countries to set ambitious 2030 emissions reduction targets, particularly the big nations, the G20 nations, the big emitters. And they pledged in July at a meeting I attended of the climate and energy ministers that they would do so before COP26. And of course, we need the developed nations to deliver on the $100 billion a year in climate finance support that they have promised developing countries. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely a matter of trust. And I'm working with colleagues on putting together a delivery plan, but the money has to come through. We also need to finalize the Paris rulebook and agree those crucial next steps for the multilateral process. And of course, we need companies to join the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience campaigns that have been running. And we need action in critical sectors. Sectors that are contributing a huge amount to global emissions and where cost-effective solutions are absolutely there for the taking. Power, road transport, land use, these are our focus areas for COP26. And right now, a quarter of global emissions come from the power sector. So we need countries to consign coal power to history domestically and to stop financing coal projects abroad. And we've seen some progress on this. All the G7 nations have committed that they will largely decarbonize their power sectors in the 2030s, that they're going to stop financing coal projects overseas. But we also need financial institutions to phase out coal, and companies to join the RE100 campaign, committing themselves to using 100% renewable energy by 2050. Now, road transport is also another big sector for our focus. It accounts for 10% of global emissions. So we need countries and vehicle manufacturers to set dates to end the sale of polluting vehicles, and fleet-owning companies need to sign up to the EV100 campaign, so that by 2030 they are using zero-emission vehicles only. And finally, on land use. That accounts for almost a quarter of global emissions. We need to call time on deforestation. So we want to see global markets support sustainable production, companies to remove deforestation from their supply chains, and financial institutions to have zero deforestation impact across their portfolios, including investment and lending by 2025, because now is absolutely the time to act. So let's hear some big, bold statements from countries and companies about how they're going to protect the planet and turn those commitments, really importantly, into action. And this is the week, in UNGA Week, this is the week in New York Climate Week, where there is an opportunity for countries and companies to set out their commitments. And I'm absolutely delighted that New York Climate Week is being held in collaboration with COP26. We're very, very happy and proud of that. So my final message is, please help us to build momentum towards those negotiating rooms in Glasgow and throughout the global economy, so that together, in this pivotal year for the planet, we keep 1.5 alive. And the final thing I want to say before I hand over to my friend Patricia Espinosa is that with 6 months to go to COP, I gave a speech and I asked my daughters, what message should we send to world leaders? What should I say? What's a simple message to world leaders? And they told me that what I should say is tell world leaders to pick the planet. And that's what we all need to do, each and every one of us. Let's pick the planet. So thank you very much for listening to me, for inviting me. And I now want to hand over to my dear friend and colleague, Patricia Espinosa, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a big mouthful, the UNFCCC. And she's going to talk a little bit more about the expectations for COP26. Thank you.
I'm grateful for the invitation to join you at this opening session of the New York Climate Week, which every year brings together so many global leaders committed to contribute to address the existential challenge of climate change. This gathering is particularly relevant and timely as we look ahead to the final and very critical weeks before COP26. As I have only a few minutes to speak, let me get straight to the point. COP26 must be a success. As we've seen from climate disasters throughout the world, and from what science has made extremely clear, we have no other choice but to make it a success. It's important to keep our eyes on what must be accomplished. There are 4 key areas. First, it is vital that parties fulfill their pre-2020 commitments. Doing so will be a key factor in the ultimate success of our deliberations. To that end, a roundtable on the pre-2020 agenda will be held at the conference. A central discussion point at the COP will be the provision of financial support to developing countries, especially in relation to the goal of mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020. That pledge was made over 10 years ago. It's time to deliver. And of course, we continue to call upon all nations to submit more ambitious and higher quality NDCs. The relevant discussions at COP26, informed by our most recent synthesis report, must provide a positive signal that the world is determined to transition towards a low-carbon future. Second, it's also time to wrap up outstanding negotiations and actually implement the Paris Agreement. And that includes resolving the complicated issue of Article 6 on carbon pricing. We cannot keep pushing this from COP to COP. It's time for bold and courageous decisions by parties on this issue, as well as several others. For example, parties must ensure the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement is consistent with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. They must also advance work in areas related to adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage. The Paris Agreement established a global goal on adaptation to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability to climate change. At COP26, parties should agree on how to assess progress towards achieving this goal. Technical issues may not capture the headlines, but they are critical, absolutely central to whether the world implements the Paris Agreement and gets off our current path of destruction. In short, the details matter. Third, success also means countries committing to do much more on all key aspects of the climate agenda. To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we urgently need ambitious, rapid, deep, and sustained emissions reductions globally. That includes national climate action plans aligned with science and long-term strategies that can get us to climate neutrality by 2050. The Secretary General has also called for 50% of the total share of climate finance provided by all developed countries and multilateral development banks to be allocated to adaptation and resilience. And we need wider-ranging and comprehensive financial support for developing nations. On the private sector side, we call upon all businesses and investors to align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals by 2024. Finally, and perhaps most critically, success means ensuring that no voices remain unheard, nor viable proposals left on the table. In this regard, I welcome the work of the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience coalitions, as well as the new Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. The power and influence of such impressive teams of cities, regions, businesses, investors, and educational institutions from all over the world have been remarkable. This is inclusive multilateralism at its finest and remains fundamental to reaching our climate goals. Dear colleagues, success at COP26 is critical for the world to get back on track, not just with respect to the 1.5-degree climate goal under the Paris Agreement, but to meeting our SDG goals as well. There is no doubt that global leaders will face a significant agenda in Glasgow. But billions around the world look to them to make the bold and courageous decisions necessary to finally implement the Paris Agreement, significantly boost climate ambition, and ultimately get humanity off its current path of destruction. We cannot let them down. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone that's joining us all around the world. It is a real honor, and it's really exciting for me to be here today, probably the first event in this lockdown period. We've heard loud and clear the code red for humanity from last month's IPCC report. And the COP presidency and the executive secretary have just underscored how pivotal this COP has to be to keep 1.5 degrees alive and to build resilience. In that sense, I'm really delighted to be joined today by Dr. Susan Chomba, Director of Vital Landscapes for Africa and the WRI, and one of our global ambassadors for Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, and Elizabeth Wathuti, young activist and founder of the Green Generation Initiative, to set the scene for the rest of the session and discuss quite honestly, how are we feeling with this scenario? Given this bleak outlook, what can we do now with real urgency and intent to change our course and set up all of us on track to limit the worst impacts of the warming planet? I would like to open a discussion, and in that sense, Susan, I would first welcome you. Thank you for being one of our global ambassadors. And I would like to turn to you first and to ask you, are you still hopeful? And if so, what gives you hope, and what do we need to do to turn hope into confidence?
Thank you so much. And I am so glad to be joining the New York Climate Week from Nairobi. And of course, we've heard about the code red, the IPCC 6th report, giving us really a stark warning there in terms of what we need to do. And so for me, Gonzalo's, I am very, very hopeful. And I'll give you 3 reasons why I remain hopeful. First is the big restoration movement that we are witnessing in Africa, in other parts of the developing world, in Latin America, in Asia. Land restoration, we know very well, is one of the key nature-based solutions that we have that can be able to tackle climate change, sequestering at least 10 gigatons of CO2 every year. In Africa, we've seen movements under the AFR 100, that's the Africa 100, which is an ambition to restore at least 100 million hectares by 2030. We've also seen efforts under the Great Green Wall, down from the Sahara Desert. And all of this really, this is taking local communities who are taking matters in their own hands, looking for solutions, nature-based solutions to help us solve the climate crisis. So that gives me a lot of hope. The second thing that gives me a lot of hope is what we've witnessed under the Food Systems Summit. I have been involved in some of the solution clusters under Food Systems Summit. Basically, the last 1 year, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people come together to say we need to transform our food systems. We've heard very well from previous speakers that agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, deforestation, burnings of savannas, peatlands, when we destroy those, we are at least contributing to a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's no solution that can be on the table under COP26 without taking into account agriculture and other land uses. And we've seen coalitions of farmer voices, decision makers, scientists come together to look at food systems and how we can be able to transition them. So for me, that gives me a very good sense of hope. And just to give an example, in places like Asia, we're seeing places like India, the movement towards agroecological transitions in Andhra Pradesh. In a country like Sri Lanka, governments making bold movement towards food systems transition. So it's not just about talk. We are seeing traction. We are seeing action on the ground. And last but not least, something that gives me a very big hope is the push towards just transition. The recognition that we are not going to solve the climate crisis if we are not all acting together. And so push for just transitions in rural areas, in urban areas, in the energy sectors is critical. We are realizing we need to be inclusive. We are realizing that we are in this together and we need to work on this together. And so for us, under the Race to Resilience, our commitment is at least to see 4 billion people whose resilience is built so that they are thriving in spite of climate change. And so those, Gonzalos, are really some of the key 3 things I'd like to highlight that give me a lot of hope that humanity, we are still on the trajectory to make a change.
Thanks so much, Susan. Not only bringing hope, but bringing your energy and your capacity, connecting the South to the North. So listening those words from New York makes so much sense, and I highly appreciate that. Let me turn now to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, being a father of 3 girls that are also not only suffering from eco-anxiety, but also environmental activists, as you can imagine. I would like to hear from you, from your youth perspective, how hopeful you feel, and how can non-state actors from all around the world better integrate the younger generation to address this challenge in radical collaboration?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to address this forum. And I think to begin with, I would say the latest IPCC report is a reflection of how harder it has become for vulnerable communities to be able to even adapt or deal with the worst impacts of climate change. And after all the years of campaigning, taking action on the ground, and dedicating our lives to fight for a livable world and a safe future, and not being able to see much of the change or bold action against the climate crisis, it is in itself a lot to take in as a young person. And I think young people have a right to be angry because we are no longer just reading about climate change in theory, but we are watching it unfold in front of our eyes. At the same time, environmental defenders who are the first line of defense against the socio-ecological collapse and the climate crisis are in greater danger than ever. And I think since the Paris Agreement was signed, we've seen an increment of environmental defenders who have been killed almost every week. And just recently, I coordinated a global youth statement on defending environmental defenders after Joanna Startbury, a Kenyan environmentalist, was killed for her tireless efforts to protect green spaces. She stood up to developers who are in Kiambu Forest in Kenya, like Professor Ngare Maathai, who also fought hard to protect Karura Forest. So she put protection of Kiambu Forest ahead of her personal comfort, and in the end, her survival. All of these are reasons enough to despair, but one thing that keeps me hopeful is the vision that I have for the world that I want to live in, and to know that I am not alone in this fight. There is hope in youth leadership, and there is still so much worth saving and fighting for. I personally fight because I care about this planet, I care about nature and my future, and also about our beautiful landscapes that have continued to be degraded over the years. Personally, I've experienced a non-ecological grief when trees that I planted as a child were chopped down years later, and all I could find were tree logs and stumps. And I always say that that natural world that my friends and I knew as children completely changed before our eyes. And that is why I fight. It's a natural call to action, and this is where I also draw my courage to fight on, and this is what exactly as well gives me hope. And I believe it's now time for people all over the world to lend their voices for nature at COP26 and beyond. And as a young person, to also continue getting hope that everything is working out is that among the things that need to happen must include putting nature at the center of the climate conversations. We've seen that political attention is still insufficient when it comes to nature, because the discussions about tackling the climate crisis have only a lot been centering around reducing carbon emissions, but we need to know that to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius, we also need to preserve every bit of remaining natural ecosystems on this planet. And then we also need to create green, clean, and resilient cities with an equal access to everyone in terms of the green spaces. And then we have to massively increase investments and efforts in regenerating nature, in addition to stopping the investments in fossil fuels. So I believe this is about the survival of our species, and this moment is calling each and every one of us to protect every single bit of nature that remains intact. And this is what is going to keep myself and every other young person hopeful.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Really strong words, and words that should take us in your path to the 2030 agenda. So in that sense, I would like to ask both of you, what is your vision of for 2030, and what do you think will be the main challenges in achieving that vision that we need to overcome? I'll start with you first, Elizabeth.
So I have always envisioned a world where I can live in harmony with nature. And my vision for 2030 is a just, fair, and equal recovery post-COVID-19. And this will mean putting the people who are disproportionately affected by the impacts of the climate crisis at the center. And the best thing that we all can do to help achieve this vision for every generation is to begin caring deeply about protecting our planet and life on Earth. Because if we act fast, then we can avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. I think the IPCC report should be our final warning, and we must organize, listen to the young people demanding bold climate action, and then begin to act with urgency. And right now, I think we are seeing that politicians seem to be out of step with what people want, because we are allowing policy to be swayed by the narrow interests of big businesses and developers. A very recent survey of the G20 countries showed that 83% of people really want to do much more to protect and regenerate nature. And I think this exactly is where the conversation should be with each and every one of us. So we therefore need to work together to enable and encourage countries that are affected by the impacts of the climate crisis to adapt and mitigate the impacts. And this also means that developed countries as well have to deliver their promise to mobilize climate finance and listen to the voices of urgency in Africa. We can only rise to the challenges of the climate crisis by working together and listening to the voices of young people who are every day calling for urgency in tackling this crisis, and then acknowledge that while we may all be in this same storm of the climate crisis, we're definitely not in the same boat, and we have to therefore make sure that we have solidarity for the people that are the most impacted by this crisis. And I think with this, then my vision for 2030 again will be realized. But we have to be able to overcome all of these challenges of delaying action and ignoring the fact that there is a lot of inequality existing when it comes to the climate change impacts that are affecting people right now. And then we have to bridge the gap between our words and our actions today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now to you, Susan.
My vision for 2030 is where we have completely decarbonized our economies. And I know that's quite ambitious. We are talking of net zero by 2050. But I think we should aim for really drastic transitions sooner than later. And another vision that I have for 2030 is, of course, working on the landscapes. I am a researcher, a scientist in agriculture, in forestry. And so looking at the vast amounts of land that are degraded and looking at the potential to work within this decade to restore those lands. As I mentioned earlier, that gives us a huge opportunity for sequestering huge amounts of carbon, but also contributing to adaptation and resilience of local communities. The other vision I have for 2030 is to ensure that nobody is left behind. There's no transition that is going to be fair and just if we forget about indigenous communities, we forget about smallholder farmers in Africa who are constantly working against a very challenging climate to produce food for themselves, but also for a lot of us in the world. And so looking at that, it's a vision where we are decarbonizing our economies, we are looking at transitioning in our land systems and our food systems. Now, I know, Gonzalo, that very good outlook is not necessarily a straight path. We are, as Liz mentioned, we are coming against a lot of challenges, including sometimes having interests that are against that kind of a transition at the fore. And so working against that is going to be really an uphill task. I was just looking at some of the court cases that have been put forward against, by companies that should be looking at decarbonizing our economies. And that shows us that the fight that we are going to have is going to be a tough one. Secondly, it's political bickering. We need to put that aside and realize that as humanity, we have one single shot to try and change our trajectory for the better, for ourselves and for our future generations. So I think that if we can be able to transition that, and last but not least, putting our money where our mouths are. I was extremely glad to see the mayor of New York City mention about key places that they are going to invest to transition the economies. And so it has to be that kind of leadership that we need. We need to see that on what we've been talking about, $100 billion for restoration, for adaptation, that has been promised for the last 1 decade but has not been realized. So putting our money where our mouths are, where our future is going to be critical. And so those are some of the impediments that we have to overcome to realize a good vision of by 2030.
Well, thank you both. That was a really inspired and grounded conversation. I'm surprised of how many topics did you touch? And probably many of them are not the usual ones. We're not talking about only energy and transport. We're talking about human elements, solidarity. We're talking about justice. We're talking about green recovery. We're talking about youth, gender, many, many elements that need to be incorporated into the center of not only the discussion, but mostly to the solutions. So thanks so much for this urgent call to action. I firmly believe in the power of radical collaboration and humanity's capacity if we act now to change our course. I think it is in my nature to be hopeful, but this hope is also grounded in reality. One reason for a start to be hopeful is the fact that we are welcoming today 4 new Race to Resilient partners to advance the campaign goals of, as you said, Susan, making 4 billion people from vulnerable communities more resilient to the impact of climate change by 2030, not only to survive but thrive despite of the crisis. So welcome to the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, Resilience First, the Climate Heritage Network, and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So if I can ask for a round of applause for those new partners. These partners bring the total number in the Race to Resilience to 24, representing over 2,500 non-state actors taking action around the world to build the resilience of people to climate change. We're also launching Race to Resilient Transformation for non-state actors delivering action to advance the campaign's 2030 goal, including increasing the quantity and quality of finance and investment capacity building, governance systems, infrastructure, and technological innovation. This groundswell of momentum in building resilience of the most vulnerable is absolutely crucial to us adapting to the future ahead and for placing the world in a stronger position to decarbonize at pace also set the conditions for a conversation about building back better. But we know, in that sense, we need finance to support both building resilience and decarbonizing rapidly. So with that, and I'm standing now, I'm really delighted to welcome on stage Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. Mark, great to see you. And my dear great friend Nigel Topping, UN High-Level Climate Action for COP26. Thank you both.
Thank you, Gonzalo, and for everything you're doing, and thank you all for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here at Climate Week New York. And I'm just going to spend a few moments to set the stage on what's happening in climate finance. This room knows, but the world is beginning to grasp that to meet our objective of 1.5 degrees, to keep it alive, we need to reduce emissions by 50% over the balance of this decade. This will require unprecedented investment, and that in turn depends on clear country commitments, ambitious country policies, and a transformation of the financial sector. Now, the efforts of the combined presidencies of the UK and Italy of COP, G7, G20 are beginning to bear fruit. As I believe Alex Sharma mentioned, the percentage of global emissions covered by national net zero targets has risen from less than 1/3 to almost 3/4 in the past 18 months. But as recent IPCC reports highlight, these commitments have to be matched by ambitious NDCs, by clear country climate policies that are worthy of the task at hand. And the more credible and predictable these country policies are, the more investors will pour money in anticipation, creating a virtuous circle of investment, growth, jobs, and decarbonization. My message here today is the money for ambitious climate action is there. The private sector, the private financial sector is being transformed. Ambitious climate action is not just possible, it will be profitable if countries act. The advantage of country net zero commitments is that net zero is now the organizing principle that's cascading down from the country level to the country level, or to the company level, and to the financial sector. Within a few years, net zero commitments and decarbonization plans for companies will be the norms. There's already thousands of our leading companies who have made those commitments. But to finance those plans, we need to change the plumbing and increase the commitments of the private financial sector. So let me say a few words about the plumbing. For private finance, our objective for COP26 has been to create a private financial system so that every financial decision takes climate change into account. Last November, we set out 25 main deliverables to change the information, the tools, and the markets of the financial sector at the heart of finance. We're on track to achieve them all by COP26. I'm going to highlight a few of the most fundamental. I think we all know that climate reporting is critical. What gets measured gets managed. 5.5 years ago, in the run-up to Paris, TCFD was a concept. 3 years ago, the first recommendations were delivered to G20 leaders in Hamburg. Today, virtually the entire financial sector wants this disclosure. Our best companies are beginning to provide it. The private sector has taken climate reporting about as far as it can. Now's the time to finish the job and make it mandatory. And that is coming. The G7 in July committed to mandatory climate disclosure. The G20 supported the FSB's roadmap, which at its heart has the FSB's work that includes support for the IFRS's new International Sustainability Standards Board. What you need to know about that is that it will have TCFD disclosure at its heart, and it will reach out to 120 countries around the world, and the first recommendations will come by the middle of next year. Better disclosure and a heightened sense of urgency around the issue is leading to a transformation of climate risk management. A few years ago, the central banks, 8 central banks got together in something called the NGFS to work on climate risk management. Now there's 90 central banks and supervisory authorities covering over 85% of global emissions, covering all of the world's globally systemic institutions. Supervisory expectations are changing. more than 50% of those emissions are going to be subject to climate stress tests. And this approach is being reinforced by the IMF, who will make it part of its annual country reviews. In parallel, insurers are developing, and this will be released at COP, the Global Resilience Index, which is a comprehensive global risk map, the focus obviously on developing economies and small island states to help us better manage climate risks, physical climate risks, close the protection gap, and target adaptation investment. Our plumbing work aims to also identify and measure the opportunities in the transition, because if you're part of the solution to an existential risk, you create tremendous value. My final element I'll mention on plumbing, and it picks up on a bit of the conversation we just heard on nature-based solutions, is the importance of scaling voluntary carbon offset markets. Over the past year, 400 different organizations from around the world, the private sector, the NGO sector, the official sector, have gathered together to produce a blueprint for scaling those voluntary carbon markets. The governance structure is being put in place and will be announced within weeks. And there's real prospect to scale this essential market by 100-fold by the middle of this decade. Now, this means benefits for biodiversity, for indigenous peoples, and for growth. That's the plumbing. We need commitments. The core commitment, 18 months ago when we started this journey, Nigel, there was $5 trillion of assets around the world committed to net zero in the financial sector. The goal initially set was to double that. It's now $90 trillion. These are the leading banks, insurers, asset managers, pension funds around the world who are committed to net zero. This is the gold standard for sustainability pledges. If you see a financial institution that talks about sustainability, ask if they're part of GFANZ, because if they're part of GFANZ, they're part of the race to zero led by Nigel and Gonzalo. And they are truly committed. Short-term objectives, clear annual reporting, developing approaches to wind down stranded assets transparently, and support those companies who are part of the solution. In the past few months, we've added $20 trillion to that to bring it up to $90 trillion. New alliances for financial services providers and insurers are being launched this week. And by Glasgow, the world will know which financial institutions are part of the solution and which are outside the GFAN tent and remain the problem. Now, last word on a crucial issue, which is the investment in emerging and developing economies. 3/4 of the annual energy infrastructure investment needs to happen in those countries. It's only going to happen if we turn billions of public capital into trillions of private capital. And this room knows, and this virtual room knows, we are far off the mark. Of course, we need ambitious country plans, and we need good investment environments. But we also need a radical change to the international financial architecture. We think we should create COP country platforms to deliver a trillion of new annual private capital flows to emerging and developing economies by the middle of this decade. And this is on top of everything else I've been talking about. Combine ambitious country plans with these net zero aligned balance sheets of GFANZ and the support of multilateral development banks to coordinate that financing and bear the risks that the private sector cannot. Let me conclude. The momentum in the private financial sector reflects an increasing recognition that climate change is not just a risk that we must manage, but it's also the biggest opportunity for jobs and growth in our economies. It's an opportunity that we must seize. And the private financial sector can help deliver. This will be one of the core messages for COP. It's underpinned by that plumbing, a financial architecture that encourages every financial decision to take climate change into account. It's helped by those credible and very large-scale commitments to net zero. Let's put that money to work to drive green growth today for our fellow citizens and to make our planet worthy of the generations to come. Thank you very much. And It now gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend. Notice that Nigel was Gonzalo's good friends. I was just someone he introduced, but he's my good friend. Nigel Topping, high-level champion, amazing individual. We've worked very closely, and everything I just said would not have happened without his leadership. So Nigel Topping and more. Thank you.
Thank you, my good. I'm going to have to say my good friend Mark every time now, so he doesn't get a complex. Thanks, Mark. I mean, look, we all know there's a massive job to finance the transition of every sector of the economy, and I think what Mark's crucial leadership is doing is helping us figure out how to transition the finance sector so that it can support that. Let me start by thanking the Climate Group for pulling together this event under these extraordinary circumstances. I think always innovative and great to see you all here today in person, but also virtually, and to gather so many leaders together, as has become our habit under the Climate Group's curatorial stewardship every year. Everything we're hearing today tells us that we have to shift gears. We really need to get into implementation, action. What are we doing in the next 5 years? What's everybody doing across their full scope of activities? The NDC synthesis we've heard about tells us that we're not on track at all. So what we're going to do today is talk about immediate action. So that, what have we got to do to win the race to zero emissions and that better world that really is the promise of the Paris Agreement. As we know, that I'm sure you're all obsessed with this, that current NDCs lead to an increase of emissions by 16% instead of the 50% reduction that we need. So we have our work cut out. And we're experiencing it every day, it seems, on the news with these extreme weather events. So as we like to say, every fraction matters. Every year, we call it a race for a reason. But there is good news. We see real momentum, exponential growth in, you've heard about the race to resilience, and Mark's talked about GFANZ. And in race to zero, I can tell you that today we have over 6,200 companies, investors, cities, regions, and university. And that's almost double since this time last year. So we're really seeing it grow very, very fast. Those between them, they cover nearly 15% of the global economy and over 11% of the population. And actually, we think there's a lot more cities and regions that will join by Glasgow. So what we're going to do now is talk about how we go from individual commitments to systemic change. First thing I'd say is that the race to zero only exists because of partner initiatives. We're going to hear from Cara of Amazon about one of those shortly. But the systemic change we laid out, Alok Sharma in January talked about the ambition breakthroughs we need to reach in every sector. We call these the race to zero ambition breakthroughs, and he set out that we would try and get to 10 of those by COP. I can tell you today, out of 28 sectors, we've already reached 15 sectors, and that's where we get at least 20% of the main actors to join the race to zero. And we're now moving from ambition to action, so we're focused on what we call the 2030 outcome breakthroughs. And those are things like getting to 40 million tons of green steel or 60% of renewables in the global power grid. So let's talk about now how we're going to do that through the panel. I've got 4 great speakers. I'm going to be joined on stage by Bob Moritz, the Global Chairman of PwC, and Cara Hurst, VP and Head of Worldwide Sustainability at Amazon. And online, we've got Ruth Porritt, the CFO of Google, and Fernando Gonzalez, the CEO of Cemix. So I'm going to get straight into it. Bob, you've got a hard stop quite soon, right, Bob?
Keep going, don't worry.
Bob, okay, so the science says we need a half emissions by 2030 to keep 1.5 alive. You've been doing analysis as a firm on the progress you're making. How does that break down here and now? What's the pace? And year on year, what do we need to do in this decade?
Yeah, so Nigel, thanks for that. And let me just sort of square this up for everybody. We are behind. The reality is when we look at the numbers, you look at what I'll call the academic studies, at least our research would say we don't necessarily have to double the efforts, triple the efforts. We actually have to five-fold the increase of the change that we need to do to decarbonize the world that's going on right now. So the conversations that we've been having so far today, and I think leading up to COP26, and more importantly thereafter, is going to be how do we pull together all the puzzle pieces and start to connect them sector by sector, session by session, country by country, to do this, because everybody's individual efforts is great, but it's in silos, and it's minuscule compared to the total of decarbonization that we got to deal with. Never mind everything else to what I'll call deal with carbon capture, deal with the agility that's going to be needed to work in this world going forward. So what we've got to be doing now is actually get these groups together. Mark just talked about bringing the finance institutions together. The financial institutions are great. Now let's bring the multi-development banks together. Let's actually get the government organizations together to do this. Let's get the business community in here to pull things together. The quicker we can pull those pieces of the puzzles together and then paint the picture with a holistic puzzle, the better off we're going to be.
And do you think we're making progress in terms of pulling those coalitions together?
The good news is, from my eyes, seeing companies around the world interacting with government officials, NGOs, and the like, we are making progress. You are starting to see these pieces to come together. The ask here for the audience, and more importantly, those that are not in the audience, we need 8 billion people to make this a personal cause. The world has never seen a challenge like this probably since World War II. And the reality is we got to mobilize the whole world, because the enemy is actually the facts and the science, and we can coalesce ourselves together to make it come to life. That's where we got to continue to be agitators, activists, and progressionists in terms of moving this forward and put the pressure on everybody.
Thanks, Bob. That's a lot of what we're trying to do with the Race to Zero now, is around each of those sectoral breakthroughs, converge all the different plans. Great. Let me turn that to Ruth from Google. Ruth, thanks for joining us. Now, you've got a very bold task. By 2030, you're aiming to be the first major company to operate 24/7 carbon-free. So tell us a little bit about what that actually means in operational terms.
Absolutely. Great to be with you, and thanks for the question. So climate action has been core to Google since inception. We've been carbon neutral since 2007. By 2017, we were matching 100% of energy consumption with renewables, and then we set this goal. As you said, by 2030, we want to run 100% of our data centers, all of our office campuses on renewable energy 24/7. And we're seeing progress. At this point, 5 of our data centers are actually running on renewables about 90% of the time. That's a start. We're continuing to push forward aggressively on it. And we set the goal because our view very strongly is that a critical part of solving the climate change challenge is transforming all electricity grids and moving them to carbon zero. And very much to Bob's opening comments, we would strongly invite everyone who is not yet committed to run 24/7 on carbon-free energy to do so, and do so immediately. And so to your question, the way we're really approaching this is 2 major things. One is driving innovation in how we buy energy from our suppliers, and the second is really in a carbon-free technology. So for example, last year we signed our largest ever corporate solar and storage agreement in Nevada, and you'll be hearing more come. Similarly, on the tech innovation front, we have projects like Always On, Next Gen Geothermal, that's going to play a key role, and more. But then also to Bob's point, we're all in this together. So another key part of what we're focused on are the policy measures. Public policy changes are needed to enable everyone, everywhere, to be able to purchase clean energy. And we're advocating for public measures to remove barriers and give companies access to clean energy by partnering with organizations like the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance in the US, the Resource Platform in Europe. And we know that we're not able to drive the global scale changes that are needed individually, but very much, as with all of these opening comments, are of the view that if the public sector, private sector, civil society come together, it is through innovation, it is through collaboration, it is through policy changes, we'll be able to make these steps that are needed. So thank you very much for the question.
Well, thanks, Ruth. I think you just highlighted 2 of the keys to this success of radical collaboration, the coming together around problems like whether it's RE100 or REBA or the others that you mentioned, and advocating for the kind of policy that's needed as well, right? Because as we all know, the private sector can do a lot, but it can't do it on its own. But I know there's another lever that you're pulling in terms of your huge reach and the work that you're doing to enable partners and Google users to take action. Tell us a little bit about how you're working with them to help them adopt solutions at scale? The billion people that Bob talked about.
Well, there actually are a number of different ways where we're really trying to work across areas. I'd say you're asking about the billion users. I think one of the most exciting things that we set is a goal that by the end of next year, through product changes, we will enable 1 billion people to make smarter choices when it comes to climate action. And we look at everything from maps and search, YouTube, every element of our products. How can we help people do exactly what so many people are looking to do, which is individually make a difference. So for example, when you search for routes on maps, we'll provide the most carbon-free route, same with airline travel, and there will be more to come. We're excited to be working with our partners to help them look at how they can consider what more they can do. And I think that not only is this the right thing for the planet, but it also makes our products more relevant. But it doesn't actually stop there. You know, on decarbonization, I think that one of the things that's so important is that we all come together as well. And that's why we're working with the UN and Sustainable Energy for All to launch this 24/7 carbon-free energy compact. I think that's a critical element of it. And then similarly looking at how we can use AI and partner with policymakers to actually make a difference where they need it. So for example, one of the most deadly outcomes from climate change, as we so tragically see time and time again, is flooding. And so looking at how we can use AI to help with early prediction so policymakers can actually intervene in the right way. And there's more products, you know, in that same vein where we're looking at how, again, partnering, we can drive the kind of action and personal change that's needed.
Great, thank you so much. I think a really nice demonstration of, if you like, getting your own house in order, then looking at your extended reach. And I think, Cara, we can talk about Amazon in a similar sense. One of the things I find slightly puzzling sometimes is people often refer to Amazon as a tech giant, but you're about as engaged in the physical economy as anybody, right? So you've got hugely ambitious goals. Tell us a little bit about some of the investments you've been making in transforming your own operations to go to zero carbon.
Absolutely, and thanks for having us at Climate Week NYC. So one of the things that we know that we can do at our scale at Amazon is that we are in multiple industries, and we do touch a lot of the biggest ways and industries that we think we can decarbonize by demonstrating that we're both a buyer of those services, sending those market signals that companies really need decarbonizing products and services, and then deploying those in our own operations and decarbonizing first. So we look at transportation and logistics, of course, and think about how can we electrify our fleet. We've placed an order for 100,000 electric delivery vans that are already on the road in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Detroit. We'll have all 100,000 operating by 2030. So therefore, to the earlier points, we also need partnership with cities and urban areas and infrastructure to support that electrification. So this is a collaboration. We look at the built environment and think about the building materials that are going to need to transform some of the embodied carbon you see in the built environment. And how can we use better cement products, better steel? How can we build differently? And then, of course, for our customers who shop online, we have tried to make it easier for people to find products that are climate friendly. So we have a climate pledge friendly group of products that is based on third-party certifications that people can easily find that. And we're also doing things to make our packaging, take waste out of those packaging materials, make it more recyclable, and less materials involved in an overall waste footprint. So we're doing a number of things to bring down our own carbon intensity. And then, of course, we've committed to the climate pledge, which is our commitment to reach net zero carbon by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. So we're really looking at the science all of the time, which has really pushed us to act with urgency. When we established the climate pledge, we committed to 100% renewable energy by 2030. And we looked at that again and said, we think we can go faster. So we pulled that goal up to 2025, and we're really pushing very hard. Again, sending those signals that we want to see greener grids. We're a purchaser of wind and solar, and we hope others will join us in that as well. So I think it's a number of different big levers that we can pull in addition to some of the policy pieces that have been mentioned already.
Now, of course, Gonzalo and I don't have any favourites because we're egalitarian, but we do love the Paris 10 years early spirit of the climate pledge, one of the partner initiatives within the Race to Zero. And Gonzalo and I were just taking some selfies. There's some big climate pledge hoardings, or electronic hoardings in Times Square. And I know, Amazon and Global Optimism have made a big announcement today about a big new number of companies joining. Just tell us a little bit about how that's going and what's the announcement today.
Absolutely, and you're right. It was a really interesting conversation to approach Christiana Figueres, who architected the Paris Agreement, and say, we want to go faster. What do you think about that? And what do you think about inviting companies to join this push to 2040? Because the urgency is needed based on what we're seeing in, what the science is telling us, what the IPCC reporting is telling us, that we need to get there faster, that we're seeing the effects of climate change in more devastating ways. So that's a great push for everybody. We're extremely excited. We're 2 years into the pledge at this point, and today we're seeing over 200 companies commit to that goal, which is incredible. So that kind of commitment to the urgency across really 26 different industries, companies from 21 different countries. They represent about $1.8 trillion in revenue and have over 7 million employees. So that kind of scale allows those big market signals really to be received in great ways. And we're investing through our Climate Pledge Fund, which is a $2 billion fund to invest in early stage decarbonizing technologies, again, across transportation, logistics, built environment, regenerative agriculture, and so forth. So I think all of that signals that during this pandemic, which is a very critical time for the world, which obviously many companies were focused first and foremost, as they should be, on the health of the employees and the communities where they operate, that sustainability has stayed at the top of the agenda. And I think that's really important. And we're seeing the momentum of the pledge continue to grow, which is incredible.
No, it's very exciting. And we've also been pleasantly surprised at how that momentum in the pledge and the broader Race to Zero has continued to grow. Also, I love your story about setting a 2030 target and then quite quickly, that seems to be quite a common experience, right? Of when people set bold targets, start making momentum, learn, and then pull the targets forward. Yeah. Thank you, Cara. Sure. Now, some industries are harder than others to decarbonise, right? And for a while, we used to talk about the hard to abate sectors, including steel and cement. We know they've got very different challenges in that they have CO2 emissions at the heart of the manufacturing processes which create those materials. So I'm delighted to be joined by Fernando from Cemex. Fernando, you're one of the world's biggest cement manufacturers, for those of you who don't know Cemex. And Fernando, you've demonstrated that heavy industries are not, they might be hard to abate, but that's not a reason for not abating them. In fact, they can become hotbeds of innovation because they must be abated. I know you've recently committed to reducing your emissions by over 40% by 2030. And again, remember, this is from a process which the very manufacturing of the product, because of the chemistry, creates emissions. So tell us a little bit about that journey. It seems to me that this is a very old industry. I think the Romans used cement, right? So it's at least 2,000 years old, but it's suddenly becoming a very innovative industry. Give us a sense of that journey that you're on.
Sure. Let me start by thanking the invitation to this opening event. And, how to put it, I think this is an old industry. I think the idea of moving towards a green economy is not new, meaning we've been for decades speaking and developing actions in order to transit into a green economy. But I think this time is completely different. So what is new is how the whole ecosystem is demanding and properly defining actions for all of us to move towards a green and circular economy. And our industry has the capability to respond. So let me try to summarize the very few issues that I find are key for our industry to succeed in a green and circular economy. The first one is to widen our value offer on low carbon products in the market. So our customers, builders, whoever build buildings or infrastructure or whatever, they do have options for products with a much lower carbon content. The products exist. It is just that they are not widely used in certain markets because norms and regulations and construction uses are not the ones that allow the promotion of this type of products. But that's one, is widening and consolidating the value offer of low CO2 products in the market. We do have a family of low carbon products, even including a CO2 neutral ready-mix product We call it the Bertois family. That's a long story. I'm going to leave it there. just to say there are options, and they are currently available in the markets we participate. The other group of actions are referred to reducing our carbon footprint. In that part, I'm going to mention just very few and key aspects. The cement and ready-mix industry in a circular economy is an industry that shines. We can absorb at least 50 times the residues and waste created by society and other industries when compared to the residues we do generate. So how to reduce the process emissions, as you were mentioning, Nigel, is by having the support in order for us to use residues from the steel industry, from the electricity industry and other industries with cementitious properties, so we can use it to reduce the carbon content in our products. And the other one is also referred to circular economy, which is to take advantage of the energy content in waste that in most of countries, in most of economies, we are landfilling. We are not reusing. We are not recycling. And we are not giving value to the energy that we are landfilling. As you know, this biomass or this energy gets decomposed. It generates methane, and every ton of methane generates 20 tons of CO2. And we can use that, if properly structured, we can use that instead of using and extracting additional primary fuels.
Yeah.
So those are examples of the kind of things we can do to reduce our footprint.
Great.
And another very relevant one is the availability of clean and renewable energy, electricity. So I'm going to stop there because, you know, there are lots of other issues, but I think those are the most relevant ones.
Fernando, thank you so much. When we partnered with TED to do TED Countdown last year, Cara spoke there, we had some of the talks that were most watched were the talks about what's happening in the cement industry, an old industry that's become a really innovative one. So thank you, Fernando. I wish we had more time because every one of these leaders could teach us all so much more, but I think we've heard a real call for urgency from Bob. We need to go 5 times faster, but then from the three of you, we've all heard about how much faster we can go if we put our mind to it. Let me leave it there, but we're going to now pan on to the next panel because every one of these changes also has a human element. It requires new skills, some jobs passing away, new jobs coming forward. It's sometimes a real dislocation. So we really need to think about how we take an integrated approach to getting to a resilient net zero world where we all thrive. And to do that, I'm really delighted to be handing over to another good friend, Hindu Ibrahim. Hindu is the president of the Association of Pale Women and Autochthonous Peoples of Chad. And she's going to lead the next part of this panel in a critical discussion on how we take this integrated approach. So we don't get blindsided by our excitement about technology, but remember that at heart, this is a human transition. So with that, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists and invite Hindu to take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nigel and Gonzalez, for all your leadership. And hi, everyone. I'm joining you virtually today. As Nigel said, I'm from an indigenous community, so that's also how we are doing about the environment. We have here about hope, about urgent action in the way especially to cut the emission at the pace. We are impatient. We can't wait and watch. We have to act. Even from the finance, we hear from Mark Carney that the finance sector that integrating climate into their decisions. But we now need more than that. We need to preserve our natural things and humanity's health to achieve these better, greener, and healthier futures. As indigenous peoples, we say if you protect nature, nature will protect you back. That means your health, food, medicine is all related to the environment. Today, I'm so delighted to be joining on this panel by two leaders in sustainability space. Roberto Marc, who is the executive chairman and group CEO of Natura and CO. And of course, Dame Emma Woolsley, who is the CEO of GSK, to explore how we can implement all this integrated approach of nature, climate, and health. Roberto and Emma, thank you for joining me. So listen, Roberto, I'm going to start with you. Let me just first ask you in 2 minutes, please tell us why you got involved in Amazon and what have you done?
So first of all, Hindu and Emma, so great to be with you in this very important panel, in this very important week. The Amazon, it is the most diverse ecosystem in the world. And in fact, is one of the largest carbon dioxide sinks in existence. So it's a very important asset for the region, for Brazil, and for the world. As a Brazilian at heart, a company originated in Brazil, but with sustainable development goals as a North Star for us, Natura actually has been working in the Amazon for over 20 years. Alongside the local communities, which are in fact the true guardians of the forest, with this goal of really protect and to regenerate nature, right, which we know is super important. And it's interesting that over this period of time, we estimate that Natura itself, which is just a beauty company in the world, we being able to actually preserve over 2 million hectares of the forest and invested over $400 million in the last 5 years. But working alongside 7,000 Amazonians family with the local communities is really the true essence, what we believe is an unlock to create sustainable development and yet preserve and most important, regenerate the forest, right? And it is so critical that we want to actually bring other companies alongside. We actually are launching what we call Plena Mata, which is a new monitor tool, very important, I would say, Hindu, to create awareness about how we're really doing in the Amazon. And that's in partnership with Mapa Biomas and Info Amazonia. And it's just give everybody a good way to really understand what's happening. Our goal is to bring other companies, is to bring, academia, is to bring NGOs, private sector and also public sector to understand that the only way to actually protect and regenerate Amazon is to create this notion of sustainable development and at the same time working very closely with the local communities in the region, which are the true guardians of the forest.
Roberto, this is very important what you said the last. You want to bring all those peoples from the corporate to all the civil society and local communities together. And how are you going to do that? What will be the lesson learned that maybe can enable other corporate also to learn from you and bring the peoples together to work to protect our nature?
It's a great question. I would probably start saying, we needed to set both targets. And we heard that from Nigel, we heard that from Gonzalo, and then measure progress. What gets measured gets done, right? And we also need to be held accountable, right? Both the private sector and also the public sector needs to be held accountable in terms of what's our roadmap, how we're going to really get this done. But setting both targets, for example, embracing science-based targets, making sure that we really have a path to carbon neutral or path to zero emission, it's very crucial. But it's also equally important how we think about protecting and regenerating nature. And that's why we are advocating to really have something very clear about the approach of nature-based, an approach of protecting and regenerating nature. But at the end of the day, this is about collaboration, right? We cannot do it ourselves. It's really, as you said, bringing all stakeholders. in this topic, we think that it's less about competition. It's more about collaboration and co-creation. And we think that, you know, the race to net zero is just a very important call to action to everybody that needs to work alongside the local communities, etc., to really establish those goals and then deliver and being held, you know, accountable against those targets.
Thank you so much, Roberto. This is really very inspiring, and I hope that many other corporates will also join you on that. But let me take you in, Emma. So you are also transforming GSK's business model to lead in mitigation and adaptation to protect nature and preserve health. In 2 minutes, may you please tell us what are you already doing to continue enhancing effective medicine while decarbonizing at pace?
Well, thanks so much, Hindu. And I'll start by saying the two are actually incredibly linked. The science is very clear that both nature loss and climate change are already harming human health, from air pollution to threats to water security to the spread of new infectious diseases. And in fact, earlier this month, there were 200 different health science journals that came together to warn that the greatest threats to global public health right now are the continued failure to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and the failure to restore nature. So we have to act now to protect and restore the planet's health if we're really going to protect and improve people's health. So that's why, as a science-based healthcare company, GSK has committed to net zero impact on climate and net positive impact on nature by 2030. So over the next decade, we're going to reduce our environmental footprint, and when it's unavoidable, really balance the remaining impact through programs to capture carbon and restore nature. That's not only going to protect the environment and in turn health, but also make our business more resilient, protecting our operations and the products our patients and consumers rely on. On nature specifically, we've set targets on water impact, material use, including plastics, as well as targets to limit pharmaceuticals in the environment and really protect biodiversity. And to deliver on our ambition over the next decade, exactly as Roberto said, we're taking action and setting all these targets now to decarbonise at pace, and it's all about getting it done. We're rapidly moving to renewable energy. In fact, we announced just today major investments in renewable energy at 2 of our manufacturing sites, one at Irvine in the UK and one at Oak Hill right in New York State in the US. And that's all about supporting our target of sourcing 100% of our global electricity from renewables by 2025. We're reviewing product development end-to-end, including redesigning all the chemical processes involved in manufacturing medicines like those for HIV and ovarian cancer, so they are less carbon intensive. And we're developing a green pathway for our metered dose inhalers. These help millions of respiratory patients every single day around the world, but 45% of the carbon impact from our pharma and vaccines business is from the propellant that's vital to get this medicine into people's lungs. So we're now testing an alternative which has the potential to reduce our gas emissions from inhalers by 90%. And we've joined the LEAF Coalition, an ambitious public-private initiative which is designed to provide results-based finance to countries committed to protecting their tropical forests. So all of this is definitely challenging, but we are so determined, with near-term as well as long-term targets that we want to be held accountable for, and with the right incentives to back this. And most of all, our people are so motivated to deliver because they see such a direct and strong connection to health and our very purpose as a company to prevent and treat disease.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you take the point talking about the health. Of course, people that are listening, they are going to hold you accountable. And because we need to see your net zero is going on. So you talk about the health, but very short one, please. When you look forward, so how are you thinking about meeting the health challenge in the warming world?
Well, we're building a new GSK with new ambition and purpose to unite science, talent and technology to get ahead of disease together. that's a company that's going to focus on the science of the immune system, human genetics, and advanced technologies to really impact the health of more than 2.5 billion people over the next decade. But I've got no doubt that getting ahead of disease at this scale is going to mean adapting to new health challenges that this warming climate is bringing and playing our part in getting ahead of climate change. Because it's already increasing the transmission of and the spread of vector diseases like malaria and dengue fever. And the evidence suggests humanity's overexploitation of nature has been a key factor in spread of diseases like Ebola, AIDS, SARS, and swine flu. And now, of course, COVID-19 is shining a very bright spotlight on the fragile relationship between the health of our planet and its people. We're all living, working and travelling in previously untouched parts of the world and interacting with nature in very new ways. And these interactions can bring real risks that emerging infectious diseases pass from animals to humans. So we've got to draw on our leadership and expertise in infectious diseases to address these challenges, whether it's our work in malaria, our COVID vaccine development programs, or indeed addressing global health long-term threats like antimicrobial resistance. And alongside many in our industry, we're working to improve future pandemic preparedness so we're all better ready next time. We've joined G7 and industry leaders to plan to develop and deploy high-quality diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines in just 100 days after a new pandemic threat is identified. And we're supporting collaborations which have brought together world-leading companies across academia, social and private sectors to harness the power of data for better surveillance and better protect the world against future health crises.
Thank you.
So we're going to play our part in building strong health systems, especially in countries and communities that face the dual challenge of weaker healthcare infrastructure as well as vulnerability to climate.
Thank you, Emma. Those actions are incredible, and I hope that they are going to be equitable and accessible for the peoples to do not be left behind. So we know that we are running out of the time, but I have a quick follow-up to both of you. Very quick one, please tell me. Roberta, so from Natura, what benefit are you realizing from enhancing a generative circular business model? You're already doing a lot, but we really wanted to hear very short answer in this.
So the first one, of course, is bringing, the customers, which let's not forget, before they are customers or consumers, they are citizens. And they want to get involved. They want to understand what the companies are doing, and they want to engage. They want to help. So the more we engage with the citizens and with the society in general, the more we can actually advance this agenda as well. But the second one is to help build this agreement on nature. We're really going to advocate for something analogous to the Paris Agreement that will push for regenerative practice, which will benefit business and also the planet. So really trying to drive this agenda on an agreement on nature, I think it's very important.
Thank you so much, Roberto. We're really looking forward for those actions. Emma, very quickly also, please, at which level do you think it's most impactful to work to make change? Because you really name it a lot.
Yeah, well, the shortest answer is at all levels. As Roberto and many others have said, we have to collaborate with suppliers, governments, peers, competitors, our partners and our people. And that's why I've been so thrilled that we've announced today, as Nigel was talking about, that the pharma and medtech sector has reached the Race to Zero breakthrough status. That means a critical mass of our companies have brought clear ambitions for the long term, made commitments to net zero with transparent objectives. We're really focusing on this in the sector because COVID has made so crystal clear it's radical collaboration that's going to power the pace of action we need to protect the intrinsically linked health of our planet and the health of its people.
Thank you so much, Emma. So I take it from where you leave it. Health of our planet is health of the human being. So we know that all of us, we cannot do it without collaborating, partnership, making more action to all the net zero. When we protect our nature, we are protecting our own health. So we all also know that when we emphasize on the critical importance of an integrated approach for climate, health, and nature, and therefore also to see Race to Zero and Race to Resilience as two sides to the same coin. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is Harry Boycott, Senior Partners at McKinsey, to hear more details on the arresting new research from the Race to Resilience campaign, which only further emphasize the need for transformation action now. Thank you so much, Emma and Roberto, and welcome, Harry.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Well, the IPCC report in August showed that continued changes to the Earth's systems are locked in. And on Friday, the UN NDC synthesis report indicated some progress to reduce emissions, but not yet enough. As Nigel said about half an hour ago, we're nowhere near. So we need to place greater emphasis on building resilience against inevitable climate hazard. But where and how and by whom? Recent McKinsey analysis for the UN Race to Resilience shows both the urgency of the need and helps direct our focus. This is urgent because by as soon as 2030, almost half the world's population could be exposed to climate hazard. And we need to act fast because the most powerful way to limit humanitarian exposure is to suppress climate hazard by reducing emissions. In a 1.5 degree world, almost 1 billion fewer people are exposed to climate hazard than in a 2 degree world. And we need to focus because the effects of climate hazard will not be felt evenly. Newspaper headlines in Europe and the US this summer showing flooding, fires, and hurricanes capture attention, but are not the real story. More profoundly, in a 2 degree scenario, for about 1.3 billion people, it could be too hot to work outside at least 25% of the time. There are 10 countries where more than 90% of their population will be exposed. And people in the most vulnerable third of the world's population are twice as likely to be exposed to climate hazards. And they, of course, are the least responsible, generating only 13% of emissions since 1990. Now, to date, resilience has been an area for development agencies in the third sector. This valuable, indispensable work will not be enough. As Mark said earlier, we need to mobilize more private sector capital. Companies who act now to build their own resilience to climate hazard will not only improve the lives and livelihoods of their colleagues and the communities in which they operate, but also they will build a lasting competitive advantage that will drive shareholder return. In crises, early resilience drives long-term performance. Our analysis of the financial crisis just over a decade ago showed that those companies that acted early on the basis of well-formed hypotheses about the future gained a small advantage quickly, which they continued to build on for the next decade. By 2017, the cumulative shareholder return of the typical resilient was more than 150 percentage points above the non-resilience. Investor, regulator, and customer assessments of your resilience will impact valuations, capital raises, balance sheet risks, brand strength, supplier footprints, as well as customer willingness to pay. So a company whose assets are built in locations with a lower frequency of extreme climate events will have a higher ability to maintain productivity and drive down unit costs relative to its competitors. If your supply chains and manufacturing are comparatively fragile, you will incur relatively greater cost in working capital or contingency arrangements. If you can't work well with local and national governments to ensure your staff in developing countries can either get to work or work effectively remotely, then your business continuity will suffer. So for the corporates watching, do you know how fragile your assets are to climate hazard today and how that will evolve? Do you know how that compares to your competition? If not, then answering these questions is where to start. For companies, the race to resilience is a race worth winning for themselves and all of us. With that,
I'm now delighted to hand over to Vice President Al Gore to offer some final remarks and wrap up this session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin quickly by offering my deepest gratitude to the Climate Group and to the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience teams for kicking off Climate Week with this important conversation. And I especially want to commend my friend Nigel Topping and his team for driving a truly remarkable groundswell of concrete climate action. The scale of what you've built with more than 6,000 organizations stepping up to the plate is truly impressive, and it's exactly what we need to meet this crucial moment. As you know, the realities of the climate crisis have never been more stark. The IPCC's Code Red report underscores what all of us are seeing all around us. And, of course, Mother Nature is sounding the alarm ever more loudly and insistently, often, unfortunately, with tragic consequences. So clearly, we've long since run out of time for half measures, much less for vague promises for action decades into the future. We must act now with urgency and determination. We must meet this moment and drive transformative, systemic changes. Our collective ability to reach net zero has been stymied for far too long for a lot of reasons. I want to focus on one in particular here. It's been in part because of a lack of transparency and accountability in emissions data. Government policymakers, as well as leaders and decision makers in civil society, corporate sustainability, investing, and innovation, all need accurate, reliable, and actionable information in order to inform their emissions reduction strategies. Likewise, advocates and those tasked with tracking progress in decarbonization have largely lacked the crucial tools they need to effectively hold the global community to account. That's why last week, the Climate Trace Coalition, of which I'm a convening member, released the world's first comprehensive accounting of global greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions, based for the first time primarily on direct, independent, real-time observation. This inventory is open and accessible to anyone looking to inform their decarbonization decisions with clear and accurate data, data that allows them to drive action. It's all online right now at climatetrace.org. Our goal is to help usher in an era of radical transparency and universal accountability by putting everything out in the open, because we believe strongly that you really can only manage what you can measure. Indeed, for far too long, government leaders, executives, investors, and climate advocates have been forced to rely on data that is way too opaque, data that's filled with gaps and omissions and driven almost entirely by self-reporting that can take years to collect and verify and is years out of date by the time it arrives. For governments, business leaders, and advocates alike, accurate and comprehensive emissions monitoring is typically either prohibitively expensive or logistically impractical at the scale that's needed to collect truly actionable information. In fact, more than 100 countries lack access to comprehensive emissions inventories of any sort from the past 5 years. Likewise, nearly all nations lack emissions data across all major sectors of their economies for last year. Now, just pause for a moment and think about what this lack of information means. For example, think of what it would mean on a personal level. Anyone who's ever had to manage a household budget can understand the value here. If you had to reduce your own spending, you would want to know exactly how much you had spent last month and over the previous year. You'd also probably want to get into some specifics, such as identifying how much you had spent on groceries or your rent or your car payments. If the problem was large enough, you'd likely want to call in an accountant to track down all of the information you need to make sure you're finally on the right path. Well, that's what Climate Trace is helping to provide where global warming pollution is concerned. Independent accounting, verification, and tracking of all global emissions. We're utilizing data from more than 300 satellites, more than 11,100 sensors, and scouring any and all information we can find to produce timely, accurate, and specific emissions data. And we're harnessing the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify patterns and trends that will allow us to get more specific than ever before and improve rapidly with each successively more granular iteration as new data comes in every day. For example, already we're able to see that just this year, emissions from steel production in China, the world's leading producer of steel, are on pace to increase by an amount that's equal to the total annual emissions of Singapore. Soon, we're going to be able to estimate emissions from every single individual power plant, all large factories, and all other major sources of emissions on a monthly and then weekly time scale. We're putting everything out in the open in order to make climate action easier and to accelerate our progress in the race to zero. It's advances like these in transparency, in clean energy and efficiency, advances driven by human ingenuity and innovation that give me a tremendous amount of hope for our future. We have the solutions we need to tackle the climate crisis, and they're getting better by the day. But we also need you. As we close out today's event, permit me to challenge all of you to dig into the details on net zero. Ask the tough questions. We need you to drive the transparency, accountability, and ultimately the solutions to this crisis. Our future depends on it. Thank you.